On the mountainside above White Kingston, in the island of Jamaica that shines like a cat's eye in the blue tropic sea, there lies buried a friend of mine that saved a ship for me. She was an old wooden craft, but as pretty as you ever saw. If you could have watched her raise herself out of green water like a strong creature taking a glorious long breath, or push into a valley of sea like a horse breasting a fence, you'd never have wanted to see a finer sight, or wonder why I wish for her sticks and spars, shining brave and bold against the sky, instead of this mastless red and black funnel that I'm commanding now. Well, it's all over now. We've got to study coal and let the winds go by if we want to stay at sea. But this friend of mine, he sailed with me when sailing was sailing. Lord, though I miss him. Yet, come to think of it, how could he ever have contented himself to go to sea on one of these rumbling machine ships? If I hadn't wanted a berth, I'd have let my first impressions of the new owners of this ship that I'm going to tell about decide the question. I could spot in a minute where they'd done mean things to her, let a bit run down here and there, give her cheap fittings where her old owners would hardly have been contented with the best, skimp paint and like that. You couldn't really say just how she looked bad, but bad she looked, at least to me, who had often envied the Firefly's captain when I was commanding only a second-rater in the same line. The new owners were mean people. Everybody on South Street knew that, so I didn't make much talk. But you can bet there was some quiet overhauling of rigging until I had the dear old craft as trim and able as she could be. She took on a fair cargo, but there was so much room aboard that it gave me a chance to load a little on my own account. I drew all my savings and invested them in goods that I knew would go well in the Windward Islands and the Bahamas, where we were bound. The new owners being so mean, I felt like asking no favours, so I paid freight on the whole outfit and saved as much of the difference as possible by not insuring my stuff. Soon enough, I was glad I hadn't asked any favours of them, for they ran in a second mate and a carpenter on me that was simply rotten. I sized them up when they came aboard, and 2 days were enough to convince me that they were no good. I made a big kick to the owners, but it wasn't of any more use than arguing with a mudbank when you're fast on it. So we put to sea, me mad as could be, the second mate and the carpenter so blamed respectful that I felt like punching them, and my friend swearing as he always did when we weighed. He didn't know any better. You see, he was only a green parrot. 4 days of good run brought us well south, and soon we were running beautifully in those lazy seas, with mighty little to do except to let the trades blow us. On the 5th day, when we were at dinner, the parrot suddenly hops over to the second mate and says in a grunting tone, "Hand me that auger." "Darn you," yells the mate, "you green beast," and makes a grab for the parrot. "Here," said I, getting mad, "let that bird alone. Are you drunk to make a fool of yourself because a poor fowl makes an innocent remark to you?" "Funny for the man to get mad about a thing like that," said the first mate. He and I had been old shipmates. He didn't like the second mate any better than I did. "Funny, funny, funny," jeered the parrot, and laughed and cackled like a crazy thing. Maybe we wouldn't have thought any more about it if it hadn't been for something that happened shortly afterward. I was on deck when I heard the parrot screeching, and I dived below just in time to catch the carpenter trying to seize the bird. When he saw me, the man mumbled an excuse about the bird having tried to fly out of an open port. And as a strange thought had come into my mind, I pretended to believe him. Then I called the first mate. "Did you," says I, "hear any talk about this ship before we sailed?" He looked at me kind of embarrassed and said finally, "Just fool longshore talk. I guess you heard it yourself." "Well," said I don't know. What was the yarn you heard?" "Oh, some blamed chin music about the owners having money trouble and the ship and cargo being insured way over the value. And the parrot said something about an auger." "By George," shouted the mate, "you're right." And he started for the hole with me behind him. After us flew the parrot, and when we got well down, he flapped and ran ahead to a dark place. There he commenced to peck at something, dancing and screaming. "Auger, auger, auger, hand me that auger." Well, you can imagine the rest. When we brought the lantern to bear on the spot, there was a nice big plug fitted into a newly bored hole in the ship's bottom in such a way that it could be knocked out easily with a mallet. We had the mate and the carpenter aft in a minute, and they gave away the whole snap. They'd been hired to scuttle the ship, and the parrot that had the run of the whole place had been so full of blessed curiosity that he'd followed them in the hold and had watched them. He was quick as lightning at catching on to strange phrases, and he had heard the mate ask the carpenter for an auger. We put him in irons and turned him over to the authorities at the first port, just charged them with mutiny, and they had sense enough to let it go at that. No use, you see, in giving the ship a bad name. That's why, when that bird died on the last voyage he made with me, I buried him all grand and human-like, and had a stone put over him saying, "In memory of a friend that saved the ship." It was my love for fresh codfish, broiled, that saved the last filibustering expedition but one that got to Cuba. Very slick little expedition it was too, I can tell you, and a good many surprised Spaniards can tell you the same, barring 3 who found it out too late, I fear, to really find out anything to be of use in the future, which, it seems to me, is the only reason for finding out anything. This little picnic was commanded by me, and I had a mighty fine schooner for the purpose. She was one of those great main-built craft that one could use for any kind of a cruise. We had intended to take on the arms and things off the New Jersey coast, down Barnegat way, but some thief of a spy smelled a rat, and the Spanish consul, who ought to come under the offensive partisan clause, made so many representations to the government that we found a revenue cutter waiting for us when we got down to the rendezvous. That broke up our game, and when night came we sneaked back to port. The lighter's captain had got scared pretty badly, and by the time I reached the city next day he had infected his owners with it, so that they nearly threw me out when I demanded that they keep their contract. They told me that if I didn't take the stuff right off their hands, they would turn it over to the government. Now, I don't believe in a paternal government myself. I esteem Uncle Sam too highly to put him in the position of taking arms away from insurgents, merely out of a sense of duty. But for a while it did look awfully as if the old gentleman would get them. I couldn't find a tugboat or a lighter that would do the work for less than almost what the whole cargo was worth. They all knew that I was in a hole, and they worked me. That was all right, purely a case of business. But so is A.B. Hawser, master, a case of business. And I decided then and there to carry out an idea that had been sticking in my crop for some time. All that I needed was to get a few good trusty men with trucks, and the Cubans got them for me fast enough. Then I set sail and nodded pleasantly in passing to the revenue cutter people. They're all right. They do their duty, but they don't take any malicious pleasure in it. I knew they'd follow me, and they did. But I dropped them easily when it got dark, and while their lights hung around off Rockaway Beach, we were merrily running into Rockaway Inlet and sliding over the groundswell into Jamaica Bay. I had run sloops and other craft in there many a time, and the channel didn't bother me. Soon we were lying at our ease under Rockaway Point, and having a quiet laugh at our friends in the cutter outside who were cruising around faithfully. Early the next morning I took a boat and rode to Canarsie. From there I telephoned the right people in the city, and before night the first innocent truckload of arms came trundling peacefully into Canarsie. Now, you can bet that before that truck arrived I had announced all over the place that I was waiting for it. I knew the inborn curiosity of the baymen too well to start it working, so I went out of my way to explain that I had run in with a deckload of lumber, and that I was waiting for a load of agricultural implements to take down south. I explained to the Canarsians that my shippers had found it cheaper to truck the stuff down to me than pay for towing the schooner into New York Harbour. When the first truckload arrived, I took care to drop a case accidentally, and out fell a couple of dozen axe handles. You see, I knew that the baymen would feel a good deal better after they saw some of the goods, so I had taken the precaution to have a salted case in the bunch. Oh, I knew my baymen. After that, they began to drift away, and they paid no more attention to us. Always remember this: there's nothing more easy to satisfy than idle curiosity. Satisfy it, and you'll escape suspicion. To make doubly sure, we took on only part of the cargo at Canarsie. We let the other trucks meet us at other places along the shore, working the same innocent scheme at each one, and in the night time we took as much more aboard as we could without being seen. We were ready to slip out next morning. All that was keeping us was a delay of the last truck, and as it seemed likely to keep us a few hours, I decided to try for codfish a little way down the channel. We didn't have much tackle aboard, but I managed to scare up a big ball of marlin. There must have been a couple of 1,000 feet of it, and I was rigged up soon enough. I anchored about 1.5 miles below the schooner, right where the big red can buoy swings. I hadn't been fishing long enough to get a bite when a little naphtha launch comes snooping along from up the bay. She stopped when she was about 1 mile or so below me, and the next thing that I saw was my friend the revenue cutter coming in from outside at a great rate. The launch ran over to the cutter, and I saw one of the 3 men in the launch stand up and point to the schooner. That was enough for me. I'm a modest man. I can't help it. It's my nature, and somehow I felt particularly bashful just then about meeting strangers. So I got up anchor in a hurry and pulled like a good 'un for the schooner. My plan was to get sail on her and run up the bay into some of those mixed-up channels for which Jamaica Bay is famous. I knew 'em like a book, and I felt pretty sure that I could get the cutter pretty neatly tangled up. That would give us a chance to make a run for it. Anyway, it was our only hope. I'm sure that the scheme would have worked beautifully if it hadn't been for one thing. The revenue cutter suspected me and overhauled me. "That's the captain," said one of the men, and with that they ran over to me and told me to give them my painter. There's no use kicking, and I nearly made the mistake of my life. That is, I nearly said, "Die." But the cutter had barely got away with me in tow, like a fool raft, when I had an idea. Always keep your matches and your ideas handy when you're at sea. This idea made me uncoil that great ball of marlin in a hurry. Then I pulled in on my painter hand over hand till my boat was well under the stern of the cutter. I held on to the gunwale of my captor and asked the deckhand who'd been told off to watch me for a light for my pipe. Somehow, I never had so much trouble to light a pipe as far back as I can remember. Match after match went out, and all the time I was letting that marlin run out on the sly. At the same time, I edged alongside a little bit more until I was so far above the cutter's screw that it was easy to make the stuff foul it. As soon as that happened, curiously enough, I got my light and dropped back. The marlin ran out like lightning, and it was with sincere pleasure that I saw it get well into the screw shaft. Just as we got within about 500 feet of the schooner, the last of it ran out, and there came a ruck. It made a beautiful mess, and the harder the screw hammered, the harder the marlin jammed it. I didn't have time to watch the subsequent proceedings on the cutter. My painter was cut, and I was on board the schooner before you could say Jack Robinson. Luckily, I had an exceptionally smart mate and crew, and they had made ready to run as soon as they sighted the cutter. So all that we had to do was to slip the anchor and go. Of course, the cutter people should have put their boat over at once and nailed us that way, but they were taken by surprise, and so they lay there motionless with their helpless screw and gave us the chance we needed. When they did get the boat over, it was just a little too late. We knew that we had to hurry, for it wouldn't take them long to clear the propeller. Maybe it was owing to this hurry that we ran into the launch that had remained where I had seen it first. The men in the launch were Spaniards, and when we got close to them I recognized the ugly face of one. He had made trouble for me once before when I had tried to turn an honest penny in the filibustering line. They had me in Morro Castle for a few weeks, till they found out that they couldn't prove it on me, and all the time this fellow had enjoyed himself kicking me whenever he got a chance. I found him to be a very unreasonable man down there in Havana, and it seemed that our northern climate hadn't improved him, for though any man could see with half an eye that we were in a hurry, he insisted on running his launch across our bows. Then he shouted to us to stop, and when he saw that we didn't consider it wise, he pulled out a horse pistol and began to shoot at us. My mate was at the helm, and he must have got terribly frightened, though not inclined that way generally, for he wobbled the wheel like mad and somehow ran right on top of the Spanish launch. We hit her lickety-split and burst her wide open. We didn't stop. After we got about a mile out to sea, the mate slapped his thigh and said, "There, if I ain't about the absent-mindedest galoot. I never thought to ask them fellas if they could swim." And we never found out. I don't know that I ever grieved over anything as much in my life as I do over the nicest bunch of scientists that I ever saw, who are sitting up in Disco Bay Way in Greenland, fishing for diatoms and things, and making observations, quite ignorant of the fact that after we left them, we had a more remarkable experience than any that they can expect if they stay there all their lives. It's too bad. They are the dearest old fellows, and besides, I would have liked it if the thing could have been written up in a real scientific way. To be sure, I know that nobody could understand it then, but for all that, there's something about those scientific terms that carries weight with it. As it is, I can just imagine their disappointment when we go after them next spring, and they hear what they missed. It happened this way. A few months ago, a man came to me and asked me whether I would take a cargo of professors to the polar regions, establish stations, and return for them next spring. Of course, I said yes. I knew just where I could put my hand on the thing that I wanted in a steam whaler, and I worked like a horse to get her ready. We had to carry everything that possibly could be needed to keep the expedition going for more than a year. And besides that, I had to look after those blessed scientists like a mother. There wasn't one of them who thought of anything except his instruments, and if it hadn't been for me, the 15 of them would have sailed for the Arctic seas in their alpaca coats. One amiable old soul with an immense beard came aboard with absolutely nothing for baggage except several hundred fruit jars and a microscope. He said that he was going up there to find new diatoms. I thought to myself that he'd get sick soon enough of puddling around in those regions with the thermometer below zero. But there is where I was wrong, for when we got there, the way that old file would go out for hours and come back with icicles all over him, but happier than a clam, surprised me. The queerest thing about it was that all that he collected was a lot of dirty water with little specks floating around in it. He said that the specks were the rarest diatoms that ever were, and when he got them aboard, he used to glue his eyes to his microscope and go crazy. Once we found him on the ice frozen so stiff that he seemed a goner for sure. I tried everything that I could think of, but he gave no sign of life, and I was nearly stumped when I happened to get an idea. So I yelled out loud, "Throw that jar overboard!" And with that, my frozen professor sits up so quickly that the ice cracked all over him, and he screams, "Don't you dare!" So I saved his life with my presence of mind. Well, to get back to the beginning. We got off all right and trim on December the 3rd, as you may have seen in the papers. By Christmas we had our scientists ashore all in good shape. Anything but an easy job, I can tell you, for as soon as they landed they began to potter around, and after that we had to interrupt our work dozens of times a day to save one or the other. Luckily I had foreseen trouble of this kind when I sized the party up in New York, and I had brought with me a practised Arctic navigator, whom I told off as a sort of dry nurse for the lot. They needed it, goodness knows. It seemed to me as if there wasn't a minute when somebody wouldn't shout that a professor was in trouble again, and 10 to 1 when we rush up and pull him out of the jaws of death, he'd smile at us cheerfully and ask what all the excitement was about. And yet, with all their helplessness and absent-mindedness, they didn't get into such trouble as 2 of my crew got into. One of them was my old bosun. You may remember him. He shipped with me after he was taken off the South Sea Islands, where he had that queer experience with cannibals. And I shipped Henry, the cabin boy, too, though the bosun warned me solemnly that he was worse than useless and that he would bring disaster to the ship. I will confess that Henry was enough to rile anybody. He had not taken warning from his experience with the cannibals and had spent most of his time on the way north in talking about the polar bears and walrus that he was going to shoot. He had a couple of books about frozen seas and truck like that, and he was so full of information about walrus hunting that the boatswain developed a habit of reaching for a rope's end as soon as Henry hove in sight. Well, when we got into Disco Bay, the weather was so bitter cold that all hands had to bury themselves in furs. The boatswain made a particularly imposing figure when he got his Eskimo clothes on, and when he topped off his costume with a great fur cap that he had made himself, he looked like a polar monster. A good deal of the work of landing supplies devolved on him after we had built the house for the party to live in during their stay, and consequently the old man had to make frequent trips between the shore and the house. Now, it happened that one morning, as the boatswain was pottering around on an ice floe, a piece of drift ice tilted up and he slid into the water as smoothly as a sled. Fortunately, he caught hold of the edge as he went in and managed to raise himself far enough to get his head above water. But that was as far as he could get, for his fur clothing hampered him, and he could not scramble out. When he discovered this, he began to roar for help, in tones to which ferocity was added by the reflection that the only person who was within earshot was his pet aversion, Henry. Still, even Henry was not as bad as the waterhole. So the boatswain roared lustily, and soon the cabin boy appeared in the doorway. He shaded his eyes with his hand and peered at the spot from which the noise was coming. Then, instead of rushing to the boatswain's aid, he dived back into the house, and when he came out again he had a big bear gun over his shoulder. To the boatswain's lively horror, he lay flat and aimed the weapon full at the unhappy man. The boatswain was so overcome with rage, fear, and cold that he was unable to do more than roar unintelligibly, which did not appear to annoy Henry at all, for soon a shot came chipping along the ice. The wretched man felt sure then that Henry had gone mad and was firing at him for revenge. He calculated his chances of letting go when Henry should fire again and coming up only long enough for breath. But he realized that he was too much chilled by his bath to do it, so nothing remained for him except to watch the cabin boy desperately. That engaging youth examined his gun critically, with disapproving shakes of his head after missing his first shot, and crawled a little nearer to his target. Lucky indeed it proved for the boatswain that the gun was too heavy for Henry to handle with ease. It wobbled excessively, and to this may be ascribed the fact that the next two shots whistled harmlessly over the sailor's head. The latter was so worn out with howling and holding on to the ice that his voice forsook him, and he was just about letting go when the first mate, who had been attracted by the shots, came rushing to the scene. He slam-banged Henry on the back of the head and shouted, "You young imp, what are you a-doing with that there gun, you?" "Trying to shoot that there blamed old walrus," snivelled Henry, pointing at the waterhole. The mate looked and rushed to the hole just in time to save the boatswain from sinking. "Oh, you limb," roared the boatswain as soon as he got his breath. "Won't I half murder you for that, you young devil? Oh, no, just wait till I get my dry clothes on." When Henry saw the boatswain crawl out of the waterhole, he nearly fainted with fright. "Say," he exclaimed hurriedly, "I didn't know it was you. I thought it was a blamed big walrus. Why didn't you say something?" "Say something?" shrieked the boatswain. "Thought I was a walrus? Oh, you villain!" "Now, boatswain," said the mate, slyly handing him a rope's end, "don't be violent. I'm a-going outside for a little fresh air, and I hope you'll be kind to Henry while I'm away." "I will," said the boatswain with emotion. But the story which I started to tell was this. After we had landed the scientists, we steamed north a few miles to establish the first of a series of caches for exploring expeditions that were to be sent out from the camp during the year. The members of the crew whom I selected to go ashore and form the first cache were the boatswain and Henry. I didn't send them together out of cruelty, but because I felt sure that the boatswain would have a good effect on Henry if anybody did, and Henry's constant presence would be sure to chasten the boatswain. I could see with half an eye that neither of them liked the idea, but they didn't dare to disobey orders, so we landed them with a couple of sleds and a year's provisions. Then we steamed up the coast, where we established 2 or 3 more caches, and it was about a month afterwards that we headed south again to pick them up. Well, we got there and I sent the boat ashore, but it returned after an hour with a wild yarn that there was no trace of the 2 or of a cache. I went ashore myself then, and sure enough there was no vestige of them. So we hunted around for a day or 2, and finally we ran across some Eskimo hunters, who told us that they had seen the 2 fall into a crevasse with their sled. They tried to take us to the scene, but it proved to be a worse job than they thought, for the crevasse was in a glacier and the thing had moved suddenly on account of a thaw. At last we found the place, but it was evident at once that nothing could be done, for the crevasse had closed up with ice and snow, and the Eskimos said that the bodies of the boatswain and Henry probably had been crushed hundreds of feet below the surface. We felt pretty blue when we went back to the ship. There we found that our homeward-bound hopes had been too rosy, for ice had come in and the ship was hemmed in. The weather continued bad for about a month, and we had to lie there with nothing to do except swear and freeze. One day, to vary the monotony of these diversions, we made up a party to hunt bears. We didn't get many, and finally I climbed up on the top of a glacier near the mouth of the river to look around. Of course, you've read those stories about men falling into crevasses in the Alps and how their bodies were recovered years afterwards when the glacier moved into the valleys. Well, when I got to the top of this glacier, I struck some ice from which all the snow and drift dirt had been washed, and what was left was clear black ice. I was feeling my way over it very carefully when I saw 2 dark shapes away down in the depths below me. I looked sharply, and sure enough, as you probably expected from my opening remarks in this paragraph, there were the boatswain and Henry, brought down by the moving glacier. But what you won't be prepared to hear is this. The boatswain and Henry were alive. There they were, about 100 feet below me, in a prison of ice as clear as crystal, moving around as comfortably as you could please. It took me aback, I must confess, but I recovered soon, for the boatswain had caught sight of me and was waving a signal flag. He was always a resourceful man, and he had pulled out the signal flags that had been put among the things that he was to have stowed away for the scientists. Well, by the time the rest of the party had come up, he had wig-wagged enough to tell me that they were well and all they wanted was to get out. But that was easier said than done, because since they had fallen into the crevasse, the opening had frozen solid, and it was out of the question for us to dig down to them, for they were at least 200 feet below the surface. What with wig-wagging and what we could see for ourselves, we soon made out the whole story. They had fallen through some fleecy snow which had hidden the crevasse, but luckily the sled fell down first and got jammed crosswise. It didn't stop, but it slid down so slowly that they were not hurt beyond a severe shaking up. The boatswain realized there was no way out and they would freeze if they didn't hustle, so he fell to at the sled and got out the supplies. Soon he had the blubber lamp going, and then, with the fur clothes that they wore and a fur rug that they had on the sled, they were pretty comfortable. The air came to them through cracks in the ice and was purified beautifully. They got a splendid brand of water from the inside of their home, and Henry stuck pictures out of one of his pirate books all over the ice walls. It looked quite cheerful and homelike as one looked down on it. But the question of how they were to be restored to upper air was not easily answered. Gunpowder was suggested and discarded as being too likely to kill them, even if it should succeed in splitting through the immense lot of ice that surrounded them. We set part of the crew to chopping, but it was too evidently a hopeless task. Really, it was so hopeless that I must admit that we sat around for a week doing little except a wig-wag to the two of them to keep their courage up. At the end of the week it began to thaw, but that part of the glacier on which they were slid down to the very edge of the sea. I saw that it was only a question of a day or two before it would topple into the ocean, and I was worried, for I feared that that would mean the end of them. But it happened otherwise. It split off in a great chunk and floated out into the bay as easily and gracefully as a ship. It made an iceberg about 300 feet high, and the home of the boatswain and Henry was in the very middle of it. When the iceberg floated out, the ice around the ship began to loosen, and I saw that we had such a chance to get out as we might not have had again in a long time. Quickly I gave orders to hitch onto the berg, and off we went, towing it astern. All this time I thought and thought over the problem of getting those two unfortunates out, but I could not solve it. All that I could see was to wait till the berg melted, and that seemed to be a question of years, and all the provisions would have been used up long before that. I did not have enough coal to tow the berg down to the warm waters of the Atlantic Ocean, and I feared that it would not be many days before I would have to let it go adrift. But nature came to my rescue. After we had been towing it about a week, getting into warmer weather all the time, I noticed one day that the boatswain and Henry were much lower in the berg than they had been. Measuring as well as we could, we found that they had sunk about 200 feet further. You see, the blubber lamps kept the place so warm that they melted their way into the bowels of the mass until they were in a cavity shaped like an upright cone and near the bottom of the berg. Indeed, they seemed to be so near the bottom that I was afraid another day or two of melting would let them through into the water, and then they would have been hopelessly lost, for they could not have escaped from under that great bulk. However, my fears were groundless. We didn't see it then, but afterwards it was simple enough. As the two melted their way into the berg, the cavity kept freezing up in the top. And the result was that when they had sunk their way near the bottom of the ice, the berg was like an empty bottle, with all its heavy parts above and its air-filled part underneath. In such cases, a bottle turns so that its heavy part is submerged, doesn't it? Well, that's just exactly what my berg did. On the Monday morning of the second week, it turned over as gently and gracefully as you please, and as our two heroes hung on to the cupboard that they had cut into the ice, they were right on top when the berg settled. It was only the work of a few minutes to lower away boats full of men with axes and other ice tools, and in a short while the berg was bobbing away off to the north, with our ship homeward bound for fair, with the boatswain and Henry aboard, safe and sound after more than 2 months under hundreds of feet of ice. But they had not been on the ship an hour before they commenced to sniff and sneeze, which, they said, was on account of the draughts. You see, they had not been used to draughts in the bottom of the berg. I suppose that I'm taking some chances with the United States government by telling this story, but it's bound to leak out sometime anyway, and I'd rather tell the simple truth of it right now so that I won't be misrepresented. Besides, it will relieve Boston to know what it was that caused the rumours of Spanish ships of war hovering off the New England coast. When they read this, some of my friends will understand what it was that made me laugh when they wondered whether Portland or Bar Harbor would be bombarded first. It was early in May when young Bailey dropped in on me and asked me to look at his new steam yacht, which was ready to go into commission. I started to the shipyard in South Brooklyn with him, and on the way he told me about a trouble of his. Of course, the trouble was about a girl. It beats everything the way men who haven't anything better to do than to live ashore will worry over little affairs like girls and money. Lord, they ought to go to sea and experience real serious things like fouling your anchor when you want to get away in a particular hurry, or bad setting rigging, or some of the other things I've had to trouble me. I never could see anything in a girl to bother about, and I've seen 'em all kinds and styles, white, yellow, red, brown and black. Seems to me there ain't anything to choose between them. They're all equally in the way aboard ship, and there ain't any of them that won't squeal when a little wave douses over the bow. This particular girl of Bailey's was all right as far as girls go, and I'll acknowledge that she had one or two good points. She could hold a tiller without working at it as if it was a pump handle, and she didn't come to the skipper as soon as a boat laid over in the wind to ask whether there was any chance to get ashore alive. So I kind of sympathised with him when he told me his yarn of how the old lady had been told some things about his wildness, and how she had shut down on him and wouldn't let him have her daughter. The sneak that played the trick on Bailey was a young runt named Seymour, a mean, crawling little reptile, richer than mud, with all kinds of things in the way of summer homes and horses and yachts. Now, I'd sailed the seas with Bailey's father, and the boy had been brought up almost under my nose. He could do anything with a ship, so you can see that he was an uncommonly smart young man. Of course, he had been a little gay in his college days, and that furnished just enough excuse for the story that the other fellow had sprung about him. But there wasn't anything that wasn't square about my friend, and I shook hands with him then and there and swore I'd lay out a straight course for him, or my name wouldn't be Hawser. The girl was all right. She wanted to marry Bailey, but she wanted her mother's consent. Seymour had the two of them on his yacht, and they were cruising around off Mount Desert somewhere. Well, I thought and thought, but for a while I couldn't think of a way out of the shoals. I knew the old lady, a fine old person she was, but hard as nails when she made her mind up. And after all the attempts that Bailey had made in vain to square himself, I knew that it would take some mighty fine jockeying to beat the game. I hadn't even been able to get steerage way on my own thoughts when we reached the shipyard, and there I had to get down to the serious work of examining the yacht. She was all right, fine and trim as a man of war, and then I had my idea. "Sonny," says I to Bailey, "don't tell me that the ladies or Seymour have ever seen this craft." "No, they haven't," said he. "Why?" "Because," says I, "if they haven't, I'll bet you that Mrs. Van Pelt won't want to see that rascal's face again." Bailey looked puzzled. Sure life makes a man so slow that I hate to spring a good idea on him. "Well," says I, "never mind just now. They haven't seen her, consequently they wouldn't recognise her. That gives me fair way out of this harbour. Now, didn't this young Seymour belong to the naval reserves? And if so, why didn't he enlist? Well, he said that he couldn't go without a commission, answered my boy. Good for you, says I, slapping him on the back. Now, you watch the way I'm heading and see whether you can guess at the course. I know Mrs. Van Pelt, don't I? And I'm right when I say she's as game a Yankee woman as there is, ain't I? All right, steady now as she goes. She takes Seymour's excuse for not going out to fight. But what would she do if she found out that he was a coward? Steady now. You and I know that he's a coward, for we've seen him weaken and we know his dirty history from school times up. Now, finally and lastly, can you borrow Morton's yacht without letting more than half the population on the Bowery know it? He said he could. But would you believe it, he couldn't guess my course after all my explanation. So I had to take him away into a nice quiet place and explain everything from beginning to end to him, as if he was the same little shaver that used to stand on the poop of the dear old Golden Mary with me, when he didn't know a gasket from a rope's end. It's great, he exclaimed after I'd plotted things out. But, Captain Orser, I can't let you take the risk. It's piracy, and I won't let you get into such danger on my account. Well, you know I could see how the idea pleased him all over, and I felt proud of him when he showed that he was willing to let his own interests go, rather than let me take a chance that was as easy as rolling off a log. Just like his father, the best man that ever trod a ship's deck. However, I didn't waste any time over his sentiments, and I swore that it had to be done. And it's got to be done right quickly too, says I, for you know that after this cruise they're going to Europe, and that, my son, will settle your hash. There won't be any use in you chasing after them, for the old lady won't look at you. Well, finally he gave in, and little credit to him. I haven't sailed the seven seas with all kinds of insubordinate crews without learning that when I want to get my own way, I've got ways to get it. So we laid out the plans, and I hustled back to the yacht and started the work of getting her into the water. We made a lively day of it, I can tell you, and before night she was afloat and taking on her coal. Then I hustled my schooner. You may remember her. She did a little trick in the filibustering line that I told you about some time ago. I had some beauties on her in the way of a crew, and I knew that I could trust 'em all. So I got hold of the two mates and the boatswain, and they were wild with the idea. Then we nailed two good engineers, and Bailey sent me a few fellas as firemen, who were all right, for they had worked for his father, and they swore by the Bailey family. I tell you, it pays to come from decent stock. I sent the rest of my crew to man the yacht that Bailey had borrowed from his friend Morton. That night, out we popped with everything trim. Forward we had some queer-looking things wrapped in canvas. You'll hear more about them later on. We made a good run up the main coast, and I timed it so that we raised the light off the Cranberry Isles in the entrance to Bar Harbour about 3 o'clock in the morning. There had been a couple of steamships bound in that we met on the way on the night before, and we had done some manoeuvring that made them run. How? Well, wait a minute. I ordered the steam launch over when we got off the harbour and left the yacht lying well hidden with her lights out in a snug place inshore. The boatswain and I ran in till we got to the yacht anchorage, and it wasn't long before we sighted Morton's yacht, the Angela. Bailey was waiting for us. All serene, says I. All serene, he laughed. Captain, the old coast is in a panic. 2 steamships made Boston today and reported they were chased by a Spaniard that put the searchlight on 'em and nearly got them. The sharps have figured on the description that the captains gave to the Spaniard, and they are sure it's one of the swift cruisers. We'll have a United States cruiser here inside of 2 days if the people alongshore can work it. Never mind the cruiser, says I. The main point is the Godiva here, and is Seymour going out for a run tomorrow? He is, says my boy, chuckling, but he wouldn't be going if he hadn't seen from Mrs. Van Pelt's manner that she would suspect him of being afraid if he didn't go. I saw Annie, and she is delighted with the scheme. Of course it was easy for her to insist on taking a run tomorrow, and once she gets him out of the bay we can depend on her to say cutting things that will force Seymour to sail far enough for your purpose. Hurrah, says I. When you're married I'll show that girl how to sail a ship. Mind now, everything depends on your getting to the scene in time. We steamed back to our yacht and stood off and on well away from the shore till about noon the next day, when my mate came down from the cross trees and reported that the Godiva was standing out. We ran off till the shore was out of sight, and there we lay. The Godiva went on and on to the south-east until she was far out of sight of land. Then suddenly a long slim ship bore down on her like a racehorse. At first the people on the Godiva didn't heed her, but when the stranger headed right for them all hands watched her. The rest of this part of the story was told by Miss Van Pelt afterwards, in the pauses between attacks of hysterics. When the strange ship got close enough to be seen through glasses, Seymour jumped up and shouted to the captain, "Captain, Captain, for heaven's sake, that's a warship! Oh, what shall I do? We'll all be caught!" By this time the stranger had approached so closely that the people on the Godiva could see that she was a powerful craft, with a Spanish flag on her. She had 2 yellow funnels and an immense long black gun that was trained on the yacht from a white turret forward. Other guns stuck out from her side, and soon enough there was a puff of smoke. Apparently it was a blank shot, as a signal to heave to, for there was no splash, as there would have been if a projectile had been fired. The stranger stopped and was rolling gracefully on the swells. The captain of the Godiva shouted to Seymour, "Of course, sir, we can make a run for it. We can make the land, I think, before they can catch us, if the ladies aren't afraid of his firing on us." Mrs. Van Pelt jumped up and said quickly, "Captain, I'll never forgive myself if we give up without an attempt to escape. Run for it, and never mind their shots." Miss Annie, of course, insisted on it too. You understand, naturally, that all this was being done quickly, and before another word could be spoken, the Godiva was tearing back for the land. The stranger seemed to comprehend the movement as soon as it was made, and he started in pursuit. By this time Seymour had gathered his wits enough to speak, and he gasped in a trembling voice, "I can't let you ladies take the chance. I'd rather lose my yacht. Oh, look out, they're going to shoot again." Sure enough, the men on the Spaniard were swinging their long gun around, and soon there was another puff. It was ineffective, and the failure of their aim seemed to infuriate the gunners, for the Spanish vessel spat fire and smoke 3 times in quick succession. Mrs. Van Pelt stood up in her excitement. She had refused absolutely to go below, and clapped her hands. "They can't hit us," she cried delightedly. "They can't hit us. Look, Mr. Seymour, you can see land ahead." She turned to call Mr. Seymour's attention, but he was not on deck. Miss Annie came to her, however, with a queer smile, and said, The steward reports that he is afraid that Mr. Seymour is ill. He is down below, behind a coal bunker." Miss Annie said afterward that the look in her mother's face at this intelligence would have pleased Bailey immensely, but she didn't say anything and turned again to watch the Spaniards, who had stopped firing and were crowding all steam on to overhaul the yacht. The captain nodded from the bridge to the ladies and shouted, "We'll beat them in, and there's a yacht coming out. If we can get near her, I suppose the Spaniards will quit anyway." Just then another shot boomed over the water, and the Godiva's engines stopped. "Have we been hit?" cried Mrs. Van Pelt in alarm. The captain shouted furiously through the tube. Then he stamped the deck angrily and said to Mrs. Van Pelt, "No, we're not hit. That precious owner of mine ordered the engineer to stop her. He's down there in a blue funk." "Never mind him," he yelled through the tube. "Go ahead full speed, and send Mr. Seymour on deck right away. He might get hurt by the engines." The yacht jumped ahead again. In a little while Seymour crawled on deck, urged by a fireman, who obeyed the captain's orders. Despite the danger in which they were, Mrs. Van Pelt smiled when she saw the dirty object that appeared from below. His pretty white flannels were black with coal dust and oil, and the smears of soot on his face made its paleness more striking. "I've taken full command of this ship, sir," said the captain, with a face red with rage. "I'm ashamed I ever shipped with you, and I ain't going to let the Spaniards take 2 American ladies for prisoners if we can get away, so you will oblige me by going to your cabin." Seymour never said a word, and sneaked off. He was so frightened that he could hardly walk, and altogether too far gone to even care what anybody thought of him. While this was going on, the Spaniard was gaining slowly on the Godiva, but there was comfort in the sight of an American yacht that was heading to the scene as fast as she could steam. She was a flyer, and the Godiva's captain shouted with delight, "Here comes the Angela! I guess that will scare the Spaniards off." The Angela tore on till her men were in plain sight, and then it could be seen that Bailey was in the bow at a Hotchkiss rifle, which Morton had mounted on the yacht in preparation for a cruise around the world. In addition, all the men on deck had rifles, and the big craft must have looked sufficiently formidable to the Spaniard, for as soon as the Angela had steamed by the Godiva and had passed between her and the Spanish ships, the latter circled back to sea and ran. Then the Angela turned and sped after the Godiva. When the 2 yachts came abreast of each other, a boat was lowered and Bailey was rowed to the yacht which he had saved from capture. The crew of the latter was cheering like mad, and when he came up the side he got a rousing reception. Mrs. Van Pelt ran to him impulsively and held out her hand. "You have saved us," she cried. "Is anybody hurt?" "No damage whatsoever," said Bailey. "Where's Seymour?" Mrs. Van Pelt drew herself up and said coldly, "I do not wish to discuss that gentleman." Bailey walked away from the ladies to grin. Then he excused himself and went below to seek his rival. He wasted no time in politeness. "Look here," says he, "there are several reasons why I don't want this thing to go out. One is that the ladies don't want their names to be spread all over the country. Another is that I don't want to pose as a sea fighter and be pestered all the rest of my life with fool praise. As far as you are concerned, I suppose you don't want a story of your heroism to go abroad. So I will take the liberty of fixing it with the captain to buy the silence of every man on this yacht. I'll call your attention to the fact that this is rather magnanimous of me, so you will be glad, of course, to pay whatever sum is necessary. And then I advise you to wash your face. You don't look pretty." The ladies readily fell in with Bailey's proposition to keep the affair secret, and Bailey made the necessary arrangements so quickly that he had time for a long walk with Mrs. Van Pelt, who suddenly had become very gracious. Of course, you remember what a fuss was made along the New England coast over the reports of the merchant skippers. Every man who owned a patch of land between Eastport and Cape Cod demanded a warship for its protection. When the government heard from those steamships, the cruisers Columbia and Minneapolis came scooting up the New England coast. They didn't find the Spaniard, but if they had had luck, they might have picked up a very handsome turret and smokestack made of canvas, with rivets and everything else painted on them in the best style of art. And if they had scouted a little further, they might have picked up a very remarkable assortment of long wooden spars, painted a shiny black and bored out like guns. However, the main point is that Bailey and Miss Annie are engaged to be married, and though I don't see just what fun there can be in that, he seems to be mighty happy. So I'm glad that I commanded a Spanish cruiser for a while, though I never would have believed it possible a few months ago.